This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography.
Produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 65 11 Days. For the sword outwears its sheath, and the soul wears out the breast. Byron. My release was temporary. I was given to understand that it was for a day or two, or for such longer period as the doctors might think absolutely necessary. It was a peculiar position, full of uncertainty, and it was not possible for me to settle down to anything. A fixed period would have enabled me to know how I stood, and I would have tried to adjust myself to it. As it was, any day, at any moment, I might be taken back to prison. The change was sudden, and I was wholly unprepared for it. From solitary confinement to a crowded house with doctors, nurses, and relatives. My daughter Indira had also come from Santiniketan. Many friends were continually coming to see me and inquire after Kamala's health. The style of living was quite different. There were home comforts, better food, and colouring all this background was anxiety for Kamala's serious condition. There she lay frail and utterly weak, a shadow of herself, struggling feebly with her illness, and the thought that she might leave me became an intolerable obsession. It was 18.5 years since our marriage, and my mind wandered back to that day and to all that these succeeding years had brought us. I was 26 at the time, and she was about 17, a slip of a girl, utterly unsophisticated in the ways of the world. The difference in our ages was considerable, but greater still was the difference in our mental outlook, for I was far more grown up than she was. And yet, with all my appearance of worldly wisdom, I was very boyish, and I hardly realized that this delicate, sensitive girl's mind was slowly unfolding like a flower, and required gentle and careful tending. We were attracted to each other and got on well enough, but our backgrounds were different, and there was a want of adjustment. These maladjustments would sometimes lead to friction, and there were many petty quarrels over trivialities, boy and girl affairs, which did not last long and ended in a quick reconciliation. Both had a quick temper, a sensitive nature, and a childish notion of keeping one's dignity. In spite of this our attachment grew, though the want of adjustment lessened only slowly. 21 months after our marriage, Indira, our daughter and only child, arrived. Our marriage had almost coincided with new developments in politics, and my absorption in them grew. They were the Home Rule days, and soon after came martial law in the Punjab and non-cooperation, and more I was involved in the dust and tumble of public affairs. So great became my concentration in these activities that, all unconsciously, I almost overlooked her and left her to her own resources, just when she required my full cooperation. My affection for her continued and even grew, and it was a great comfort to know that she was there to help me with her soothing influence. She gave me strength, but she must have suffered and felt a little neglected. An unkindness to her would almost have been better than this semi-forgetful, casual attitude. And then came her recurring illness and my long absences in prison, when we could only meet at jail interviews. The civil disobedience movement brought her in the front rank of our fighters, and she rejoiced when she too went to prison. We grew ever nearer to each other. Our rare meetings became precious, and we looked forward to them and counted the days that intervened. We could not get tired of each other or stale, for there was always a freshness and novelty about our meetings and brief periods together. Each of us was continually making fresh discoveries in the other, though sometimes perhaps the new discoveries were not to our liking. Even our grown-up disagreements had something boyish and girlish about them. After 18 years of married life, she had still retained her girlish and virginal appearance. There was nothing matronly about her. Almost she might have been the bride that came to our house so long ago. But I had changed vastly, and though I was fit and supple and active enough for my age, and I was told I still possessed some boyish traits, my looks betrayed me. I was partly bald, and my hair was grey, lines and furrows crossed my face, and dark shadows surrounded my eyes. The last 4 years with their troubles and worries had left many a mark on me. Often, in these later years when Kamala and I had gone out together in a strange place, she was mistaken, to my embarrassment, for my daughter. She and Indira looked like two sisters. 18 years of married life, but how many long years out of them had I spent in prison cell and Kamala in hospitals and sanatoria? And now again I was serving a prison sentence and out just for a few days, and she was lying ill, struggling for life. I felt a little irritated at her for her carelessness about her health. And yet how could I blame her, for her eager spirit fretted at her inaction and her inability to take her full share in the national struggle. Physically unable to do so, she could neither take to work properly nor to treatment, and the fire inside her wore down the body. Surely she was not going to leave me now when I needed her most. Why? We had just begun to know and understand each other really. Our joint life was only now properly beginning. We relied so much on each other, we had so much to do together. So I thought as I watched her from day to day and hour to hour. Colleagues and friends came to see me. They told me of much that had happened of which I was unaware. They discussed current political problems and asked me questions. I found it difficult to answer them. It was not easy for my mind to get away from Kamala's illness, and after the isolation and detachment of jail, I was not in a position to face concrete questions suddenly. Long experience had taught me that it is not possible to appraise a situation from the limited information available in jail. Personal contacts were necessary for a proper mental reaction. Otherwise, the expression of opinion was likely to be purely academic and divorced from reality. It seemed also unfair to Gandhiji and my old colleagues of the Congress Working Committee for me to say anything definite regarding Congress policy before I had had the opportunity to discuss everything with them. My mind was full of criticisms of much that had been done, but I was not prepared to make any positive suggestions. Not expecting to come out of prison just then, I had not thought along these lines. I had also a feeling that in view of the courtesy shown by the government in allowing me to come to my wife, it would not be proper for me to take advantage of this for political purposes. I had given no undertaking or assurance to avoid any such activity. Nevertheless, I was continually being pulled back by this idea. I avoided issuing any public statements except to contradict false rumors. Even in private, I refrained from committing myself to any definite line of policy, but I was free enough with my criticisms of past events. The Congress Socialist Party had recently come into existence, and many of my intimate colleagues were associated with it. So far as I had gathered, its general policy was agreeable to me, but it seemed a curious and mixed assemblage, and even if I had been completely free, I would not have suddenly joined it. Local politics took up some of my time, for in Allahabad, as in several other places, there had been an extraordinarily virulent campaign during the elections for the local Congress committees. No principles were involved, it was purely a question of personalities, and I was asked to help in settling some of the personal quarrels that had arisen. I had no desire whatever to go into these matters, nor had I the time. In spite of this, some of the facts came to my notice and caused me great distress. It was surprising that people should get so vastly excited over local Congress elections. Among the most prominent were those who had retired during the struggle for various private reasons. With the withdrawal of civil disobedience, those reasons ceased to have weight, and they emerged suddenly and carried on a fierce and often vulgar campaign against each other. It was extraordinary how the ordinary canons of decency were forgotten in the passionate desires to down the other party. I was especially grieved at the fact that Kamala's name and even her illness had been exploited for the purposes of these local elections. Among the wider questions that were discussed was the Congress decision to contest the coming elections to the Legislative Assembly. Many of the younger groups opposed this decision because they thought it was a return to parliamentary and compromising methods, but they suggested no effective alternative. Some of these opponents, on grounds of high principle, had curiously enough no objection to organizations other than the Congress running the elections. Their object seemed to be to leave the field clear to communal organizations. I felt disgusted with the local squabble and the kind of politics which were rapidly developing. I felt out of tune with them and a stranger in my own city of Allahabad. What could I do, I wondered, in this environment when the time came for me to attend to such matters? I wrote to Gandhiji about Kamala's condition. As I thought I would be going back to prison soon and might have no other chance to do so, I gave him also some glimpse into my mind. Recent events had embittered and distressed me greatly, and my letter carried a faint reflection of this. I did not attempt to suggest what should be done or what should not be done. All I did was to interpret some of my reactions to what had happened. It was a letter full of barely suppressed emotion, and I learned subsequently that it pained Gandhiji considerably. Day after day went by, and I waited for the summons to prison or some other intimation from government. From time to time I was informed that further directions would be issued the next day or the day after. Meanwhile, the doctors were asked to send a daily bulletin of my wife's condition to government. Kamala had slightly improved since my arrival. It was generally believed, even by those who are usually in the confidence of the government, that I would have been fully discharged but for two impending events: the full session of the Congress that was taking place in October in Bombay, and the Assembly elections in November. Out of prison I might be a disturbing factor at these, and so it seemed probable that I might be sent back to prison for another 3 months and then discharged. There was also the possibility of my not being sent back to jail, and this possibility seemed to grow as the days went by. I almost decided to settle down. It was the 11th day after my release, August 23rd. The police car drove up, and the police officer came up to me and told me that my time was up and I had to accompany him to Neni prison. I bade goodbye to my people. As I was getting into the police car, my ailing mother ran up again to me with arms outstretched. That face of hers haunted me for long. End of chapter 65. Chapter 66. Back to prison. Shadow is itself unrestrained in its path, while sunshine, as an incident of its very nature, is pursued 100-fold by nuance. Thus is sorrow from happiness a thing apart. The scope of happiness, however, is hampered by the aches and hurts of endless sorrows. From Raj Tarangini, R.S. Pandit's translation. River of Kings, Taranga, verse 8, 1913. I was back again in Neni prison, and I felt as if I was starting a fresh term of imprisonment. In and out and in, what a shuttlecock I had become. This switching on and off shook up the whole system emotionally, and it was not easy to adjust oneself to repeated changes. I had expected to be put in my old cell at Neni, to which a previous long stay had accustomed me. There were some flowers there, originally planted by my brother-in-law, Ranjit Pandit, and a good veranda. But this old barrack number 6 was occupied by a détenu, a state prisoner, kept confined without trial or conviction. It was not considered desirable for me to associate with him, and I was therefore placed in another part of the jail which was much more closed in and was devoid of flowers or greenery. But the place where I spent my days and nights mattered little, for my mind was elsewhere. I feared that the little improvement that had taken place in Kamala's condition would not stand the shock of my rearrest. And so it happened. For some days it was arranged to supply me in prison with a very brief doctor's bulletin daily. This came by a devious route. The doctor had to telephone it to the police headquarters, and the latter then sent it on to the prison. It was not considered desirable to have any direct contacts between the doctors and the jail staff. For 2 weeks these bulletins came to me, sometimes rather irregularly, and then they were stopped, although there was a progressive deterioration in Kamala's condition. Bad news and the waiting for news made the days intolerably long, and the nights were sometimes worse. Time seemed almost to stand still or to move with desperate slowness, and every hour was a burden and a horror. I had never before had this feeling in this acute degree. I thought then that I was likely to be released within 2 months or so after the Bombay Congress session, but those 2 months seemed an eternity. Exactly a month after my rearrest, a police officer took me from prison on a brief visit to my wife. I was told that I would be allowed to visit her in this way twice a week, and even the time for it was fixed. I waited on the 4th day, no one came for me, and on the 5th, 6th, 7th. I became weary of waiting. News reached me that her condition was becoming critical again. What a joke it was, I thought, to tell me that I would be taken to see her twice a week. At last the month of September was over. They were the longest and most damnable 30 days that I had ever experienced. Suggestions were made to me through various intermediaries that if I could give an assurance, even an informal assurance, to keep away from politics, for the rest of my term I would be released to attend on Kamala. Politics were far enough from my thoughts just then, and the politics I had seen during my 11 days outside had disgusted me. But to give an assurance, and to be disloyal to my pledges, to the cause, to my colleagues, to myself, it was an impossible condition, whatever happened. To do so meant inflicting a mortal injury on the roots of my being, on almost everything I held sacred. I was told that Kamala's condition was becoming worse and worse, and my presence by her side might make all the difference between life and death. Was my personal conceit and pride greater than my desire to give her this chance? It might have been a terrible predicament for me, but fortunately that dilemma did not face me in that way at least. I knew that Kamala herself would strongly disapprove of my giving any undertaking, and if I did anything of the kind it would shock her and harm her. Early in October I was taken to see her again. She was lying almost in a daze with a high temperature. She longed to have me by her, but as I was leaving her to go back to prison, she smiled at me bravely and beckoned to me to bend down. When I did so, she whispered, "What is this about your giving an assurance to government? Do not give it." During the 11 days I was out of prison it had been decided to send Kamala, as soon as she was a little better, to a more suitable place for treatment. Ever since then we had waited for her to get better, but instead she had gone downhill, and now, 6 weeks later, the change for the worse was very marked. It was futile to continue waiting and watching this process of deterioration, and it was decided to send her to Bhowali in the hills, even in her present condition. The day before she was to leave for Bhowali, I was taken from prison to bid her goodbye. When will I see her again? I wondered, and will I see her at all? But she looked bright and cheerful that day, and I felt happier than I had done for long. Nearly 3 weeks later I was transferred from Neni prison to Almora district jail so as to be nearer to Kamala. Bhowali was on the way, and my police escort and I spent a few hours there. I was greatly pleased to note the improvement in Kamala, and I left her to continue my journey to Almora with a light heart. Indeed, even before I had reached her, the mountains had filled me with joy. I was glad to be back in these mountains, and as our car sped along the winding road, the cold morning air and the unfolding panorama brought a sense of exhilaration. Higher and higher we went. The gorges deepened. The peaks lost themselves in the clouds. The vegetation changed till the firs and pines covered the hillsides. A turn of the road would bring to our eyes suddenly a new expanse of hills and valleys with a little river gurgling in the depths below. I could not have my fill of the sight, and I looked on hungrily, storing my memory with it, so that I might revive it in my mind when actual sight was denied. Clusters of little mountain huts clung to the hillsides, and round about them were tiny fields made by prodigious labor on every possible bit of slope. They looked like terraces from a distance, huge steps which sometimes went from the valley below right up almost to the mountain top. What enormous labor had gone to make nature yield a little food to the sparse population! How they toiled unceasingly only to get barely enough for their needs! Those ploughed terraces gave a domesticated look to the hillsides, and they contrasted strangely with the bleaker or the more wooded slopes. It was very pleasant in the daytime, and as the sun rose higher, the growing warmth brought life to the mountains, and they seemed to lose their remoteness and become friendly and companionable. But how they change their aspect with the passing of day! How cold and grim they become when night with giant strides stalks o'er the world, and life hides and protects itself and leaves wild nature to its own. In the semi-darkness of the moonlight or starlight, the mountains loom up, mysterious, threatening, overwhelming, and yet almost insubstantial, and through the valleys can be heard the moaning of the wind. The poor traveller shivers as he goes his lonely way and senses hostility everywhere. Even the voice of the wind seems to mock him and challenge him. And at other times there is no breath of wind or other sound, and there is an absolute silence that is oppressive in its intensity. Only the telegraph wires perhaps hum faintly, and the stars seem brighter and nearer than ever. The mountains look down grimly, and one seems to be face to face with a mystery that terrifies. With Pascal one thinks, "Le silence éternel de ces espaces infinis m'effraie." In the plains the nights are never quite so soundless. Life is still audible there, and the murmuring and humming of various animals and insects break the stillness of the night. But the night, with its chill and inhospitable message, was yet distant as we motored along to Almora. As we neared the end of our journey, a turn in the road and a sudden lifting of the clouds brought a new sight which I saw with a gasp of surprised delight. The snowy peaks of the Himalayas stood glistening in the far distance, high above the wooded mountains that intervened. Calm and inscrutable they seemed, with all the wisdom of past ages, mighty sentinels over the vast Indian plain. The very sight of them cooled the fever in the brain, and the petty conflicts and intrigues, the lusts and falsehoods of the plains and the cities seemed trivial and far away before their eternal ways. The little jail of Almora was perched up on a ridge. I was given a lordly barrack to live in. This consisted of one huge hall, 51 feet by 17, with a kutcha, very uneven floor, and a worm-eaten roof, which was continually coming down in little bits. There were 15 windows and a door, or rather there were so many barred openings in the walls, for there were no doors or windows. There was thus no lack of fresh air. As it grew colder, some of the window openings were covered with coir matting. In this vast expanse, which was bigger than any yard at Dehradun, I lived in solitary grandeur. But I was not quite alone, for at least 20 sparrows had made their home in the broken-down roof. Sometimes a wandering cloud would visit me, its many arms creeping in through the numerous openings and filling the place with a damp mist. Here I was, locked up every evening at about 5, after I had taken my last meal, a kind of high tea, at 4:30, and at 7 in the morning my barred door would be unlocked. In the daytime I would sit either in my barrack or outside in an adjoining yard, warming myself in the sun. I could just see over the enclosing walls the top of a mountain a mile or so away, and above me I had a vast expanse of blue sky dotted with clouds. Wonderful shapes these clouds assumed, and I never grew tired of watching them. I fancied I saw them take the shape of all manner of animals, and sometimes they would join together and look like a mighty ocean, or they would be like a beach, and the rustling of the breeze through the deodars would sound like the coming in of the tide on a distant seafront. Sometimes a cloud would advance boldly on us, seemingly solid and compact, and then dissolve in mist as it came near and finally enveloped us. I preferred the wide expanse of my barrack to a narrow cell, though it was lonelier than a smaller place would have been. Even when it rained outside, I could walk about in it. But as it grew colder, its cheerlessness became more marked, and my love for fresh air and the open abated when the temperature hovered about the freezing point. The new year brought a good fall of snow to my delight, and even the drab surroundings of prison became beautiful. Especially beautiful and fairy-like were the deodar trees just outside the jail walls with their garment of snow. I was worried by the ups and downs of Kamala's condition, and a piece of bad news would upset me for a while, but the hill air calmed me and soothed me, and I reverted to my habit of sleeping soundly. As I was on the verge of sleep, I often thought what a wonderful and mysterious thing was sleep. Why should one wake up from it? Suppose I did not wake at all? Yet the desire to be out jail was strong in me, more than I had ever felt before. The Bombay Congress was over, and November came and went by, and the excitement of the Assembly elections also passed away. I half expected that I might be released soon. But then came the surprising news of the arrest and conviction of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and the amazing orders passed on Subhash Bose during his brief visit to India. These orders in themselves were devoid of all humanity and consideration. They were applied to one who was held in affection and esteem by vast numbers of his countrymen, and who had hastened home, in spite of his own illness, to the deathbed of his father, to arrive too late. If that was the outlook of the government, there could be no chance of my premature release. Official announcements later made this perfectly clear. After I had been a month in Almora jail, I was taken to Bowali to see Kamala. Since then I have visited her approximately every third week. Sir Samuel Hoare, the Secretary of State for India, has repeatedly stated that I am allowed to visit my wife once or twice a week. He would have been more correct if he had said once or twice a month. During the last 3.5 months that I have been at Almora, I have paid 5 visits to her. I do not mention this as a grievance, because I think that in this matter the government have been very considerate to me and have given me quite unusual facilities to visit Kamala. I am grateful to them for this. The brief visits I have paid her have been very precious to me, and perhaps to her also. The doctors suspended their regime for the day of my visit to some extent, and I was permitted to have fairly long talks with her. We came ever nearer to each other, and to leave her was a wrench. We met only to be parted, and sometimes I thought with anguish that a day might come when the parting was for good. My mother had gone to Bombay for treatment, for she had not recovered from her ailment. She seemed to be progressing. One morning in mid-January, a telegram brought a wholly unexpected shock. She had had a stroke of paralysis. There was a possibility of my being transferred to a Bombay prison to enable me to see her, but as there was a little improvement in her condition, I was not sent. January has given place to February, and there is the whisper of spring in the air. The bulbul and other birds are again to be seen and heard, and tiny shoots are mysteriously bursting out of the ground and gazing at this strange world. Rhododendrons make blood-red patches on the hillsides, and peace and plum blossoms are peeping out. The days pass and I count them as they go, thinking of my next visit to Bhawali. I wonder what truth there is in the saying that life's rich gifts follow frustration and cruelty and separation. Perhaps the gifts would not be appreciated otherwise. Perhaps suffering is necessary for clear thought, but excess of it may cloud the brain. Jail encourages introspection, and my long years in prison have forced me to look more and more within myself. I was not by nature an introvert, but prison life, like strong coffee or strychnine, leads to introversion. Sometimes, to amuse myself, I draw an outline of Professor McDougall's cube for the measurement of introversion and extroversion, and I gaze at it to find out how frequent are the changes from one interpretation to another. They seem to be rapid. End of chapter 66.